The scratching started 3 nights after she buried her husband. Not loud, not violent, just 3 careful drags across the cedar boards of the porch like something testing the grain with its nails. Then silence again. I remember her telling me the sound bothered her more than crying would have. Animals cry when they are hungry or hurt. People cry when they lose someone. But careful scratching in the middle of a February storm meant intention, meant patience, meant something standing outside her house knew she was alone now. The first time she looked through the front window, she thought it was a bear standing on 2 legs. That is what she told the sheriff later. What she told herself for months after. A bear with mange. A starving thing driven down from the hills by snow. But bears do not stare directly into glass for 10 straight minutes without moving. And they do not leave gifts. By morning, there was a dead rabbit laid neatly beside her porch swing. Its stomach had been opened with surgical precision. No blood in the snow, no torn flesh. Just the rabbit and a circle of melted frost around it as though something warm had crouched there a very long time. You are probably already thinking she should have called somebody. Animal control, state wildlife, maybe even the police. Looking back now, I think she wanted someone to tell her it was impossible. That is the thing about grief. It makes impossible things easier to accept because your whole world already stopped making sense. I knew her before any of this happened. Before the scratching. Before the thing learned her routines. Before it followed her across 2 counties and waited outside her second house like a promise nobody could escape. Her name was Eleanor Price. 58 years old when her husband Walter died from a stroke beside their woodpile. They had lived outside Black Hollow Ridge for nearly 30 years. No children, no close family left alive. Just the 2 of them, and a weather-beaten farmhouse buried deep enough in the pines that winter silence could press against the windows like water. I met Eleanor in March of 1998. Rain hammered the roof of the trading post while she stood near the stove warming her hands over black coffee gone cold. She looked exhausted, not crying, past crying. There is a difference. Anybody over 60 knows it when they see it. She asked if I knew anything about wolves, not coyotes, not dogs, wolves. That was the first thing she ever said to me. I told her there had not been wolves in those woods for decades unless one crossed down from Canada. She nodded slowly at that answer, but her eyes kept drifting toward the windows. Then she asked me if wolves ever walked upright. That should have been the moment I walked away. Instead, I laughed. Not cruelly. Just the kind of tired laugh old men give when life starts sounding stranger than it should. I had spent most of my life around wilderness. Military tracking units overseas, then years alone, trapping and hunting after my divorce burned itself to ash. I thought I had heard every campfire story men could invent. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, mountain devils. The woods collect stories the way old houses collect dust. Still, something about the way Eleanor asked bothered me. Not because she sounded crazy, because she sounded embarrassed. Like a widow apologizing for disturbing somebody with her fear. Outside, the rain turned harder. The windows rattled. Then she reached into her coat pocket and placed something on the counter between us. A silver thimble. Tiny claw marks scarred the metal from top to bottom. She said Walter used to keep it in his tackle box because it belonged to his grandmother. Said she left it on the porch railing 2 nights earlier by accident while sewing a ripped blanket. That morning, it appeared back on the porch swing beside the dead rabbit. I picked the thing up. The scratches were fresh, deep enough to bend the silver inward. Eleanor watched my face carefully. Then she said the sentence I still hear in dreams. It keeps bringing things back. Not stealing, returning. I should have known then. God help me, I should have known then. The next evening, I drove out to her property myself, mostly because I did not believe her, partly because loneliness makes old people stupid. You spend enough years alone, and eventually any mystery feels better than silence. The road to her farmhouse twisted through 6 miles of frozen timber. Snowbanks crowded both sides. Pine limbs sagged heavy with ice. By the time I arrived, dusk had already turned the woods blue. The house sat alone near a dead cornfield, one porch light glowing weak through the storm. I noticed the tracks before I even killed the engine. Too long for wolf prints, too narrow for bear tracks, and spaced wrong. Whatever made them had walked upright for stretches before dropping back to all fours near the porch steps. The snow squealed beneath my boots as I crossed the yard. Eleanor opened the door before I knocked. She smelled like cedar smoke and peppermint tea, the kind of smell lonely houses keep trapped inside them for decades. "You came," she whispered. I almost told her I would not stay long. Instead, I stepped inside. That was my second mistake. The fire cracked softly in the living room, while wind scraped branches against the roof. Eleanor showed me the porch through the kitchen window. 3 rabbits now, arranged carefully beside the swing. 1 squirrel and Walter's missing gardening glove. Not torn apart, not chewed, placed there. I crouched beside the window, studying the tracks leading into darkness beyond the field. Something moved out there between the trees. Tall, fast, gone before my brain fully registered it. Eleanor noticed my expression immediately. "You saw it." I lied and said no. Looking back now, that lie mattered more than I understood, because from that moment forward, she knew fear had entered the room with us. Real fear, the kind no reasonable explanation can smother once it takes hold. Around midnight, the scratching returned. 3 slow drags across the porch boards. Then silence. Eleanor froze beside the fireplace, clutching her blanket. Again, scratch, scratch, scratch. I chambered around into the old rifle leaning beside the couch and stepped toward the door. Eleanor grabbed my sleeve hard enough to hurt. "Please don't make it angry." That sentence stopped me colder than the storm outside. Not afraid for herself, afraid for it. You need to understand something about grief before this story goes any further. Grief changes the shape of love. Sometimes it twists it into something dangerous. A widow alone long enough will start talking to empty rooms just to hear a voice answer back in her mind, and whatever waited outside that farmhouse understood loneliness better than any human being ever could. I opened the door anyway. Cold punched through the house immediately. Wet snow swirled across the porch. Nothing there at first. Then I noticed the smell. Rot mixed with wet earth and animal musk. And beneath that smell came breathing. Heavy, slow, close. Not because it wanted to attack me. Not because it feared the rifle. Because it was studying me. The trees stood motionless at the edge of the field. Black trunks disappearing into storm fog. Then 2 amber eyes appeared between them, 2 highs off the ground. I raised the rifle. The eyes blinked once. Then the thing stepped backward into darkness with impossible silence for something that size. No snapping branches, no crunching snow, just gone. When I turned back toward the house, Eleanor stood behind me, holding Walter's old wool scarf against her chest. "I told you," she whispered. That night I did not sleep, neither did she. And around 4 in the morning, while sleet tapped the windows like fingernails, we both heard something circling the house slowly. Not rushing, not hunting, waiting. Morning arrived gray and wet. The storm had passed east during the night, but cold fog still clung to the tree line behind Eleanor's house. I remember standing at the kitchen sink with a mug of burnt coffee in my hands while watching the woods through the window above the counter. The silence out there felt wrong. Heavy. like the forest itself was listening. Eleanor moved slowly around the kitchen, gathering dishes from the night before. She looked embarrassed by the fear she had shown me. That happened a lot with people from her generation. They apologized for terror the same way younger people apologized for inconvenience. "You probably think I've lost my mind," she said quietly. I told her I had seen enough strange things in the wilderness to stop calling people crazy too quickly. That was true. Mostly. But I still believed there had to be an explanation. A large animal behaving oddly. Maybe a starving black bear driven half-feral by winter. Maybe somebody playing a cruel joke on a grieving widow hidden deep in the woods where nobody would notice. Then I opened the back door. The tracks surrounded the house. Not random wandering, not animal pacing. Deliberate circles around every window and wall. Some passed within inches of the porch steps. Others stopped directly beneath the bedroom windows. Each print measured nearly 14 inches long. And every few yards the thing dropped from all fours and walked upright. I crouched beside one trail running toward the barn and felt cold settle into my stomach. The impressions looked almost human from a distance. Heel, arch, long, narrow toes. Except no human foot had claws buried 2 inches into frozen ground. Eleanor stepped beside me on the porch, wrapping Walter's old scarf tighter around her neck. "It stayed all night," she whispered. "Not visited. Stayed." The distinction mattered. I followed the tracks toward the barn while frost cracked beneath my boots. The old structure leaned slightly east from years of wind damage. Rusted farm tools hung inside like bones. The smell hit me before I reached the entrance. Wet fur, rotting meat, and something else beneath it. Something warm and animal. The interior sat dark except for narrow beams of morning light slicing through broken boards. Hay covered most of the floor. Then I noticed the nest. That is the only word for it. Blankets. Torn feed sacks. Dead leaves. Pieces of insulation dragged from somewhere inside the walls. All piled carefully into one corner behind the tractor. And resting in the middle of it sat Walter's missing boot. I heard Eleanor stop breathing behind me. Neither of us moved for several seconds. Then something shifted above us. A low scrape echoed across the rafters. I looked up too slowly. The shape disappeared across the beams almost silently, but I caught enough of it to freeze every muscle in my body. Gray fur, long arms, shoulders too broad for any man alive. Then nothing. Just darkness again. I raised the rifle instinctively while backing Eleanor toward the door. The barn fell silent. No growl, no movement, no charge. That somehow frightened me worse. Predators make noise when cornered. They bluff. They threaten. Whatever hid above those rafters did neither. It watched. Outside, the air tasted cleaner, but my pulse still hammered in my throat. Eleanor kept staring toward the barn entrance as though expecting something to emerge. "Did you see its face?" she asked. I shook my head. That was another lie. I had seen part of it. Long muzzle. Deep-set eyes. Ears flattened tight against its skull. Not a bear, definitely not a bear. By noon, we convinced ourselves to stay rational. Funny thing about human beings. We can explain away almost anything if fear arrives slowly enough. I checked the property line for signs of intruders. Found none. Examined fences for damaged livestock. Nothing. Eleanor insisted the creature had never harmed her directly. That sentence stayed with me. Never harmed her directly, because she already accepted danger as normal. Snow melted from the roof in heavy drips while Eleanor cooked venison stew for lunch. The kitchen smelled warm and earthy. Ordinary, almost comforting. For a few hours we pretended life still obeyed familiar rules. Then she showed me the photographs. Old Polaroids spread across the dining table beside a sewing basket. Most pictured Walter smiling beside fish or chopped firewood, but mixed among them were blurry nighttime images taken through the porch window, eyes reflecting yellow and darkness, a tall outline near the swing, and one photograph that made my stomach tighten immediately. The creature crouched at the edge of the yard holding something shiny between its claws. The silver thimble. Even blurred by distance, the posture looked strangely careful. Curious, almost. "When was this taken?" I asked. Eleanor traced the photograph softly with her finger. 2 weeks after Walter died. I studied the shape again. Massive shoulders hunched against snowfall. Long forearms hanging nearly to the ground. Then I noticed something else. Behind the larger figure stood another pair of eyes deeper in the trees. Smaller. Watching. My mouth went dry. The stories always came in pairs. God help me, I remembered that from old tribal accounts I heard overseas decades earlier. Soldiers passed stories around during long nights in remote terrain. Creatures that hunted together. One bold, one cautious. One that approached humans. One that stayed hidden. I folded the photograph carefully and slid it back toward Eleanor. "You said it keeps bringing things back. What else besides the rabbit and glove?" She hesitated. Then she opened the freezer. Inside sat wrapped packages of meat covered in butcher paper. Too much meat, far too much for one woman alone. Eleanor looked ashamed suddenly. "It leaves deer sometimes," she admitted softly. "Once it dragged an entire calf near the porch. I buried most of it behind the shed." I stared at her. "You ate this?" Her face tightened defensively. After Walter died, I couldn't drive into town much. Roads iced over. My arthritis got worse. And every time I tried leaving after dark, it followed my truck. Silence settled between us. Not because her explanation sounded insane, because it sounded practical. That is how these things happen. Not through madness, through slow compromise. One terrible decision made survivable by loneliness. I should have walked away then. Called state police. Burned the barn down if necessary. Instead, I stayed another night. Rain replaced snow after sunset. Warm winds rolled through the valley, carrying the smell of wet pine. Eleanor lit oil lamps throughout the house because the power lines near the ridge failed constantly during storms. Orange light flickered across the walls while shadows stretched long through the rooms. Strange thing to admit now, but the house almost felt peaceful after dark, like the storm outside created a boundary between us and the rest of the world. Eleanor talked more that evening. About Walter, mostly. How he built the porch swing himself during the summer of 1983. How he whistled badly while splitting wood. How he never trusted strangers but fed every stray animal wandering near the property. Then she said something that made me set my drink down slowly. Walter saw it first. Thunder rolled outside. I asked what she meant. Eleanor stared into the fire before answering. 3 months before he died, he started hearing crying near the creek. Said it sounded like a child lost in the woods. One night he followed it. I already knew the next part before she spoke. He found something injured. A smaller creature trapped beneath fallen branches near the ravine behind their property. Not fully grown, bleeding badly from one leg. Walter cut it free. That was the beginning. The younger one disappeared after several days, but the larger creature started appearing at the edge of the woods afterward, watching the house, watching Walter. Never attacking, never approaching too close, just watching. Then came the gifts. Dead animals left beside the porch. Lost tools returned after storms. Once even Walter's missing wristwatch placed neatly atop the woodpile 3 days after he lost it hunting. I listened quietly while rain hammered the roof harder overhead. Every instinct in my body screamed that the story was impossible. Yet everything inside that farmhouse carried the weight of truth. Not dramatic truth, not campfire exaggeration, tired truth, the kind people confess only after carrying it too long. Around 10 that night, Eleanor brought out an old checkers board from beneath the couch. Half the pieces were missing. She laughed softly about Walter always cheating when they played. Then she stopped smiling. One red checker remained separate from the others, worn smooth around the edges. Eleanor rolled it gently between her fingers. "It likes this one." I frowned. "What do you mean? The younger one used to take it." She glanced toward the dark window beside the fireplace. Every time Walter left the board out overnight, that checker disappeared. Then it showed back up on the porch a few days later. She placed the checker carefully beside the lamp. That little red piece became the center of everything afterward. Funny how lives collapse around small objects. Wars start over smaller things than that. Outside, the rain stopped abruptly. The silence arrived so fast it felt unnatural. Then came the scratching again, not at the porch this time, at the living room window directly beside us. 3 slow drags across the glass. Eleanor closed her eyes immediately, like someone hearing a familiar song. I turned slowly toward the window. A shape stood inches beyond the lantern glow, tall enough that its head nearly reached the top frame. Amber eyes reflecting firelight, and in one massive clawed hand, it held the missing red checker piece. The creature stood motionless outside the glass while rainwater slid from its fur in long silver streaks. I remember the strange detail first. Not fear, not the size of it. The stillness. Animals twitch, they breathe hard. Their eyes dart around searching for danger. This thing simply watched us. Its head tilted slightly sideways as though studying our reactions. The checker piece rested carefully between 2 black claws almost delicate against hands large enough to split firewood bare-handed. Eleanor whispered its name before I could stop her. Gabriel. The thing blinked slowly. That moment changed everything. Not because a widow had named a monster, because the creature responded. I should explain something now while the memory still sits clear in my head. There were 2 of them. Eleanor had named the larger one Gabriel, after the archangel from Walter's old Bible because she said it arrived carrying messages. Gifts, warnings, signs. The younger creature she called Jude. Walter chose that name before he died. Said the smaller one looked sad all the time. Looking back, I think giving them names made the situation survivable. Human beings name things they fear because names create the illusion of understanding. The larger creature lifted its hand slowly toward the window. Then it pressed the checker piece against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. 3 gentle knocks. Eleanor stood up from the couch before I could stop her. The rifle leaned against the wall near me, but suddenly it felt useless. Every instinct screamed that violence would trigger something irreversible. "Don't open that door," I said quietly. She ignored me. Of course she did. Loneliness had already rewritten the rules inside her mind. Eleanor crossed the room slowly, while the creature watched her approach. Up close, its proportions looked deeply wrong. Nearly 7 feet tall, standing upright. Thick shoulders tapering into narrow hips. Fur matted dark gray along its chest and arms. The muzzle resembled a wolf's, but broader, older somehow. Like something built from memory rather than biology. The eyes bothered me most. Not animal eyes, too focused, too aware. Eleanor unlocked the front door with trembling fingers. Cold air spilled into the house, immediately carrying wet earth and pine sap. The creature stepped backward off the porch without aggression, almost respectful. Then it lowered the checker piece carefully onto the welcome mat. Eleanor whispered a shaky "thank you, God forgive me," but the creature dipped its head slightly like it understood. Then it vanished into darkness beyond the yard. Not ran, vanished. 1 second visible near the porch steps, the next absorbed into the rain-soaked night without sound. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. The only noise came from water dripping off the roof. Finally, Eleanor picked up the checker piece and closed the door softly behind her. "You see now," she whispered. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell her we were assigning human behavior to an animal. That grief and isolation had twisted ordinary predator instincts into something else. But I had seen the creature knock. I had seen recognition in its eyes. And somewhere deep down inside me, something ancient and terrified started waking up. That night, I slept in Walter's old recliner with the rifle across my lap. The fire burned low around 3 in the morning. Wind moved through the trees outside with a sound like distant whispers. Then came another noise, not scratching, crying, high-pitched, wet, almost human. It echoed from somewhere beyond the barn. I sat upright immediately. The crying stopped, then started again farther away near the creek. Every hair on my arm stood up. Eleanor appeared in the hallway wearing a robe and clutching Walter's scarf tightly around her shoulders. "You hear it too?" I nodded once. The sound came again, softer now. Hurt, that is how it draws you out. That is what I understand now after all these years. Not through violence, through sympathy. The crying sounded exactly like a wounded child alone in the woods. I grabbed the rifle and flashlight before stepping onto the porch. Cold fog rolled low across the yard. The beam cut through mist toward the tree line. Nothing there. Then movement near the creek. Small shape, low to the ground. The crying stopped the second my flashlight touched it. 2 pale eyes reflected back at me. Jude, smaller than the larger creature by several feet, but still enormous compared to any wolf alive. Thin almost. Long limbs covered in patchy silver fur. One front leg twisted slightly inward from an old injury that never healed correctly. The younger creature stared at me silently from the edge of the woods, then looked toward the barn. Back at me again, like it wanted me to follow. I should have shut the door. Instead, I walked after it. That decision haunted me more than any other. The forest behind Eleanor's house sloped downward toward a frozen creek bed tangled with pine roots and fallen branches. Fog drifted between the trees thick enough to swallow the flashlight beam after 20 feet. Jude moved ahead of me soundlessly. Every few moments it stopped and glanced back to make sure I followed. Not hunted, guided. My boots slipped against wet leaves while cold air burned inside my lungs. Somewhere deeper in the woods, water trickled beneath thin ice. Then the smell hit me. Blood. Fresh. Jude stopped beside an uprooted cedar near the creek bank. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my hands as I approached. A deer carcass lay half buried beneath branches, not eaten, covered, like food stored for later. The creature nudged the carcass once with its muzzle, then looked at me again. I understood immediately. It was showing me, sharing. That realization frightened me more than finding the body itself. Jude stepped closer carefully. Not aggressive, curious. Its damaged leg dragged slightly across the ground. Up close, I could see old scars crossing its shoulders beneath thin fur. Bullet wounds. Somebody had shot this thing years earlier. The younger creature lowered itself slowly beside the deer carcass, and made a low rumbling sound deep in its chest. Not a growl, almost contentment. Then it did something I still struggled to explain. It pushed Walter's missing pocket knife toward me through the leaves. I stared at the knife silently. Antler handle. Rusted blade. Walter's initials carved near the hinge. The creature had kept it all this time. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. Jude flinched backward slightly at my voice. Then another sound rolled through the forest. A deep chest felt growl somewhere uphill near the house. Gabriel. The younger creature stood immediately alert. Another growl followed louder this time. Warning. Jude glanced toward the sound, then back at me, and for one impossible second I swear the thing looked afraid. Branches cracked uphill. Heavy footsteps moving fast through the trees. Jude darted sideways into darkness just before Gabriel appeared between the pines. The larger creature looked enormous among the narrow trunks. Rain glistened across thick gray fur. Its amber eyes locked onto me instantly. Not anger. Assessment. Then Gabriel noticed the rifle in my hands. The growl deepened. I raised one hand slowly, trying to calm the situation, even though I knew how insane that looked. Old man standing in frozen woods negotiating with something that should not exist. "I'm not here to hurt anybody," I said quietly. Gabriel stepped closer. The forest suddenly felt very small. The creature towered over the creek bank easily, 7.5 feet tall when fully upright. Muscles shifted beneath wet fur along its chest and arms. One ear carried a torn notch old enough to have healed years earlier. Its eyes flicked toward the pocket knife near my boots, then toward the house uphill. Another warning growl vibrated through the air. Only later did I understand what it meant. The larger creature was not threatening me. It was telling me to leave. A distant engine echoed faintly through the valley. Vehicle approaching the property road. Gabriel reacted instantly, head snapping toward the sound. Jude emerged silently from darkness behind it. Both creatures stared uphill together, suddenly tense. Then they disappeared into the forest with terrifying speed. Seconds later, headlights swept across the distant trees near Eleanor's house. Sheriff Durning climbed out of the truck while I emerged from the woods, soaked and shaken. The old sheriff looked annoyed more than concerned. Eleanor must have called him earlier before I arrived. He asked why there were giant tracks around her property again. Again. That word mattered. Eleanor stood quietly on the porch while I explained away what little I could. Large wolves. Maybe escaped exotic animals. The sheriff listened without believing any of it. Before leaving, he pulled me aside near the truck. "You're ex-military, right?" he asked. I nodded. He lit a cigarette slowly beneath the drizzle. 3 hikers vanished near Black Hollow in the last 8 years. State boys blamed weather, bears, one drunken accident. But every body we found looked wrong. Cold settled into my stomach again. "What do you mean wrong?" The sheriff stared toward the dark woods behind Eleanor's barn, like something knew exactly where to bite. Then he drove away. That should have ended things for me. Sensible men hear warnings and leave. But grief is contagious. Spend enough time around lonely people and eventually their isolation starts feeling familiar. I stayed. Days turned into weeks after that, and every night the creatures returned. Always after dark. Always silent at first. Gabriel remained cautious around me, watching from tree lines or rooftops beyond lantern light. But Jude grew curious quickly. The younger creature approached the porch often, while Eleanor sewed blankets or played old records in the living room. One evening during heavy snowfall, Jude left another object beside the checkerboard. Walter's old compass. Another night it returned Eleanor's missing sewing scissors wrapped carefully inside a torn feed sack to protect the blades. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The creatures did not understand ownership the way humans did. They understood attachment, and somehow they knew which objects carried emotional weight. That was the most disturbing part of all. Not their strength, not their intelligence, the way they observed grief itself. By late March, I started noticing other signs deeper in the forest. Massive tracks crossing ridgelines far beyond Eleanor's property. Strange stick formations hanging from trees. Half-eaten deer suspended high above ground where no ordinary predator could place them. And always distant sounds at night. Not one pair. More. The first warm rain of April turned the trails behind Eleanor's house into deep ribbons of mud. Water dripped constantly from the pines. Frogs returned to the creek beds. The whole mountain smelled alive again after winter. Looking back now, that spring feels like the last season any of us were truly happy. Strange word to use for a story like this. Happy, but that is the trap of it. Terror alone cannot hold a person for years. Fear burns too hot, too fast. What keeps people tied to dangerous things is familiarity, routine, the slow comfort of believing you understand the rules. And for a while, we thought we did. The creatures came after sunset. Always after sunset. Gabriel stayed near the woods, watching the house from a distance, while Jude approached closer. Sometimes the younger one sat beneath the porch swing, listening to Eleanor hum old songs through the screen door. Other nights, it wandered the yard collecting shiny objects left behind accidentally. Nails, bottle caps, Walter's rusted fishing lures, but it always brought the red checker piece back before dawn. Always. That became the rule. Funny how people build safety out of repetition. We tell ourselves something is harmless because it follows patterns. Every bad decision I ever made started that way. One rainy evening in late April, Eleanor cooked stew while thunder rolled over the valley. I sat at the kitchen table cleaning my rifle, mostly out of habit. Jude crouched outside the screen door watching us quietly through the lantern glow. Eleanor talked to it constantly by then, not baby talk, not madness, conversation. "You scared the hens yesterday," she told it while stirring the pot. "If you keep doing that, there won't be eggs left for either of us." Jude tilted its head slowly. Then it made a soft chuffing sound deep in its throat. Eleanor smiled. God help me, I smiled too. That is the part nobody will understand unless they have lived through deep loneliness. After enough years isolated from the world, companionship matters more than logic. The human brain starts adjusting itself around impossible things, if those things return your attention. Outside rain hammered the porch roof harder. Jude flinched at the thunder and retreated beneath the swing. "It hates storms," Eleanor whispered to me, like we were discussing somebody's nervous dog. Later that night, after Eleanor went upstairs to bed, I remained by the fireplace listening to the storm. Jude stayed outside near the porch steps. Every so often I heard claws clicking softly against wet wood. Then, around midnight, another shape emerged from the trees. Gabriel. The larger creature moved differently from Jude. Slower, deliberate, like something constantly measuring threat and distance. Water streamed from thick gray fur as it crossed the yard. Jude immediately lowered itself submissively near the porch. Gabriel ignored me completely at first. It approached the swing and placed something carefully beneath it. A dead fox, but not killed recently. The body had already started decomposing. Fur missing in patches. Flies gathering around the wounds. I frowned immediately. That was new. Gabriel stepped backward toward the yard while Jude sniffed nervously around the carcass. Neither creature touched it again. Then Gabriel looked directly at me through the screen door and growled. Low, deep, uneasy, not threatening, warning. I should have recognized the difference sooner. The next morning, Eleanor buried the fox behind the shed. She tried pretending it meant nothing, but I noticed her hands trembling afterward. Small changes started appearing after that night, subtle at first. Gabriel circled the property more aggressively. Tracks appeared closer to the house. The larger creature began pacing near windows before dawn, leaving deep claw marks in the porch railings, and the sounds in the forest multiplied. Not quite human, crying deeper in the hills. Heavy movement beyond the creek after midnight. Sometimes distant howls carried across the valley that did not sound like wolves or coyotes or anything born naturally beneath God's sky. One evening, while repairing fence posts near the field, I found a deer spine hanging from a pine branch nearly 10 feet above ground. Cleaned perfectly, deliberate, like a marker. I did not tell Eleanor. She was sleeping better by then, smiling more, eating regularly again. Grief had loosened its grip on her for the first time since Walter died. The creatures filled empty corners of her life in ways neither of us wanted to examine too closely. Looking back, I think Gabriel understood that before we did. The first real warning came during the May thaw. Warm fog rolled through the valley that morning, thick as smoke. Eleanor and I sat on the porch drinking coffee, while Jude slept beneath the swing, curled like an oversized dog. Strange sight even now in memory. Massive claws twitching during sleep. Wet nose resting across folded arms, almost human in shape. Then Jude suddenly sat upright alert. Every muscle tightened instantly. A low rumble escaped its chest. Gabriel burst from the tree line seconds later, moving faster than I had ever seen. The larger creature crossed the yard in 4 huge strides and slammed directly into Jude, knocking it sideways off the porch. Eleanor screamed. The sound that followed did not belong to any animal I knew. Gabriel snarled furiously while pinning the younger creature into mud beside the steps. Teeth flashed inches from Jude's throat. Jude whined sharply and stopped resisting. Gabriel snapped again, then both creatures froze. Another smell drifted through the fog, human scent. Truck engine approaching the property road. Gabriel released Jude immediately, and both creatures vanished toward the woods before the vehicle even appeared. A few moments later, a county utility truck rolled into the driveway. 2 linemen climbed out laughing about storm damage farther south near the river. Neither man noticed my rifle leaning against the porch wall or Eleanor shaking beside the doorway, but I noticed something else. Gabriel had not attacked Jude out of anger. It was discipline. The creatures were hiding themselves from outsiders. That realization settled heavy inside my chest. Predators conceal territory. Packs conceal young. Intelligent things conceal existence. Later that afternoon, I found deep gouges in the mud where Gabriel pinned Jude down. The larger creature's claws had sunk nearly 4 inches into wet earth. Beside them sat the red checker piece, cracked down the middle. That tiny detail bothered Eleanor more than anything else. She carried the broken checker inside carefully and placed both halves beside Walter's photograph on the mantel. "You think it was an accident?" she asked quietly. I lied again. No, because deep down I already understood. The checker piece was not a toy. It was communication, and something between the creatures had changed. Summer arrived slowly after that. Long, humid evenings filled with cicadas and distant thunder. Eleanor planted tomatoes again for the first time since Walter died. I repaired sections of fencing around the property. Sometimes weeks passed without major incidents, and we convinced ourselves the tension had faded. Then came the morning we found the dog, half buried near the creek bank. Golden retriever, collar still attached. The body looked wrong immediately, not eaten, not torn apart, opened. Precise cuts through the rib cage like something searching inside it. Eleanor turned away, vomiting into the weeds while I crouched beside the carcass trying to steady my breathing. Fresh tracks surrounded the body. Not two creatures, at least 5. Different sizes, different shapes. I felt cold despite the summer heat. The stories had spread somehow. Or maybe they had always been there beyond the ridge, waiting unseen while we obsessed over the pair near the house. That night, Gabriel appeared alone for the first time in months. The larger creature stood beyond the porch light, staring toward the woods behind the barn rather than at us. Fur bristled along its shoulders. Constant, low growl vibrating in its chest. Jude never appeared. Eleanor called softly toward the darkness. No response. Gabriel remained rigid near the field edge. Then another howl echoed from deep within the hills. Closer than before. Gabriel immediately turned toward the sound with terrifying focus. And for the first time since meeting these things, I saw genuine fear in its posture. Not fear for itself. Fear of something approaching. The howl came again. Different from Gabriel and Jude. Higher pitched, more chaotic, hungry. More voices answered farther away. Eleanor grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. There's more of them. I nodded slowly. Gabriel looked back toward the porch then. Toward Eleanor specifically. And something happened in that moment I still struggle to explain logically. The creature stepped forward into full lantern light and touched its chest once with a clawed hand. Then pointed toward the woods. Not random movement. Gesture. Intentional. I stared at it, speechless. Gabriel repeated the motion urgently. Chest, forest, chest, forest. Like it was trying desperately to warn us. Then Jude burst from the tree line, limping badly. Blood covered the younger creature's shoulder. It collapsed beside the porch with a cry so painfully animal that Eleanor rushed forward instinctively despite my shouting. Gabriel moved immediately between her and the woods. Protective. The younger creature trembled violently against the porch steps. Deep claw marks crossed its back. Not from bullets this time, from another creature. Branches snapped beyond the field. Heavy movement. Closing fast. Gabriel snarled toward darkness with such force the windows rattled. Then another pair of amber eyes appeared near the barn. These eyes were different. Wild. Empty. And behind them came more shapes moving through the trees. The creatures emerged slowly from the woods beyond the barn like shadows learning how to walk. At first, I counted 3, then 5. Then more movement, deeper among the trees where the darkness shifted wrong between the trunks. Every one of them looked different. Some larger than Gabriel, some thin and crooked with patches of missing fur. One moved low across the ground, dragging a useless hind leg behind it. Another stood almost fully upright with shoulders so broad it barely fit between the pines. But all of them shared the same eyes. Hungry. Not for food alone. Something meaner than hunger lived inside those stares. Gabriel planted itself between the house and the approaching shapes immediately, fur standing high along its spine, teeth exposed fully now beneath curled lips. Jude whimpered beside the porch steps, clutching its bleeding shoulder. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside the younger creature before I could stop her. Her hands trembled violently while she pressed an old towel against the wound. Blood soaked through instantly. Dark and thick. The smell hit the air hard enough that every creature near the woods froze. Then came silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind that settles before violence. I chambered around into the rifle and stepped onto the porch beside Eleanor. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. The nearest creature took one slow step forward. Gabriel answered with a roar that shook through my chest like thunder. I have heard lions overseas, heard bears during mating season in Alaska, heard men scream after explosions ripped through convoy trucks. Nothing sounded like that roar. The creature near the barn stopped immediately. Another shape circled wider through the field, trying to approach from the side. Gabriel shifted position instantly, blocking the angle. Smart. Tactical. Calculating multiple threats at once. That realization terrified me almost as much as the creatures themselves. The wounded Jude pressed closer against Eleanor while making soft whining sounds deep in its throat. She kept talking to it quietly through tears. "It's all right. Stay still now," like speaking to an injured horse. One of the creatures near the woods suddenly lunged forward several feet, testing boundaries. Gabriel charged, faster than anything that size should move. The impact sounded like a car crash. Fur exploded through lantern light as both creatures slammed into the mud beside the field. Snarling erupted instantly. Wet, violent, limbs twisting together too quickly for my eyes to track. Then Gabriel tore the other creature's throat open. Just like that. Blood sprayed across the grass, black in the darkness. The dying creature convulsed hard against the ground, while the others retreated several steps toward the woods. Gabriel stood over the body, panting heavily, not triumphant, warning them. The remaining creatures stared silently from the edge of the field. Then, one by one, they disappeared back into darkness. Gone. Just like that. No final howl, no dramatic retreat. Only silence again beneath the warm summer night. Gabriel remained motionless near the corpse for several long seconds before slowly turning toward the porch. Blood covered its muzzle and chest. Steam rose from wet fur in the lantern glow. Eleanor still knelt beside Jude, holding the towel against its shoulder. Gabriel approached carefully. Every instinct screamed at me to shoot before it came closer. But something stopped me. Maybe shock. Maybe the terrible realization that the larger creature had just defended us. Gabriel lowered itself beside Jude and sniffed the younger creature's wound gently. Jude pressed its head weakly against Gabriel's shoulder. The tenderness of that moment unsettled me more than the violence. Not monsters. Family. Gabriel looked toward Eleanor then, and I swear to God there was gratitude in its eyes. Not human gratitude exactly. Something older, simpler, recognition. The larger creature nudged the bloody towel carefully with one claw, then looked toward the barn. Back at us. I understood immediately. It wanted shelter for Jude. That should have been impossible. But I understood. Eleanor looked at me through tears. We can't leave it out here. Every sane part of my brain screamed against what happened next. But loneliness had already poisoned all three of us by then. Together, we moved Jude into the barn. The younger creature weighed more than 200 pounds easily, yet it tried not to resist while we guided it across the yard. Gabriel followed several feet behind, watching every movement carefully. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and wet wood mixed with blood. Rain began tapping softly against the roof overhead. Eleanor spread old blankets inside the nest near the tractor, while Jude collapsed onto them, breathing hard. Up close, the wound looked terrible. 4 deep claw marks ripped across the creature's shoulder and ribs. One cut exposed pale muscle beneath silver fur. Gabriel remained near the entrance, blocking the doorway, while I cleaned the injury with whiskey and boiled water. Jude screamed once when the alcohol touched exposed flesh. Not barked, screamed. Human enough that my hand shook afterward. Eleanor stroked the creature's head carefully while whispering soft reassurances. Gabriel watched silently the entire time. Every few minutes, the larger creature glanced toward the forest beyond the barn doors, listening for movement. Guarding. Hours passed like that. Rain deepened outside. Thunder rolled farther east toward the mountains. Jude finally drifted into exhausted sleep near dawn, while Eleanor rested against a stack of feed sacks beside it. I sat near the doorway, rifle across my knees, staring at Gabriel through the weak lantern light. The creatures stared back. Two old predators studying each other across silence. Then Gabriel did something unexpected. It limped slightly when it walked. Subtle enough I had never noticed before. Old injury. Military habits die hard. You learn to catalog weakness automatically after enough years surviving dangerous places. Gabriel carried scars beneath its fur too. Torn ear, thick white marks across one shoulder, missing claw on its left hand. This thing had survived battles long before Eleanor ever met it. Around sunrise, Gabriel stepped outside into the rain. I followed carefully. Mist hung low across the fields while distant thunder faded beyond the ridge. The dead creature still lay near the tree line, half submerged in muddy water. Up close it looked even worse. Thinner than Gabriel, fur patchy and diseased. One eye clouded white from old damage. Its teeth were worn jagged like broken glass. But the hands looked nearly human beneath the claws. Long fingers, opposable thumbs. I fought down nausea immediately. Gabriel approached the corpse cautiously. Then it looked at me, and pushed the body once with its foot toward the woods, like it wanted help moving it. "No," I muttered instantly. Gabriel stared at me, then toward the body again. The realization arrived slowly and horribly. The creature did not want the corpse near the house. It understood contamination, territory, maybe even burial. I grabbed a tarp from the barn eventually because I could not think of any better option. Looking back now, dragging that body through the woods beside Gabriel feels like crossing some invisible line humanity was never meant to step over. The forest swallowed sound quickly beyond the creek. Rain dripped steadily from pine branches overhead. Gabriel moved ahead silently while I struggled with the tarp through mud and roots. We reached a ravine nearly half a mile from the farmhouse. Bones littered the bottom. Animal bones, mostly. I stopped walking immediately. Gabriel descended into the ravine without hesitation and waited near a hollow beneath exposed tree roots. Burial site, nest, den, I do not know. But something about that place felt ancient, wrong. The smell alone nearly turned my stomach. Rotting meat, wet fur. Decay buried beneath years of rainwater and leaves. Gabriel nudged the tarp again impatiently. So together we buried the dead creature beneath loose soil and stones while fog drifted through the trees around us. Think about that sentence. An old soldier and a thing from nightmares covering a grave together in silence while rain fell through the pines. Nobody will ever believe it. Hell, some days I barely believe it myself. When we finished, Gabriel crouched near the disturbed earth for several moments without moving. Mourning. That was the word that entered my mind unwillingly. Then the creature stood and looked directly at me, closer than ever before. I could smell its breath, blood and pine sap, and something strangely metallic underneath. Gabriel lifted one clawed hand slowly toward my chest. I froze completely. The creature stopped inches away from touching me, then lowered its hand toward the pocket of my jacket. The red checker piece sat there. I had forgotten entirely. Gabriel tapped the pocket gently once, then turned and vanished into the forest. I remained alone near the ravine for a long time afterward, listening to distant movement deeper among the hills. Not one creature, several. Watching. By late summer, Jude recovered enough to move normally again, though the scars remained visible beneath silver fur. The younger creature became more attached to Eleanor after the attack. followed her through the yard constantly during evenings, slept beneath the porch swing almost every night. Gabriel grew more distant, more alert. The larger creature spent hours staring toward the northern ridges where strange howls sometimes echoed after dark. And the gifts stopped completely. No more rabbits, no returned objects, no strange offerings beside the porch. Only the checker piece remained. Every dawn Jude left it near the swing. Every sunset Gabriel carried it away again. A ritual neither of us understood. Then October arrived, and with it came the first human death. The body was found 3 miles north of Eleanor's property, near an abandoned fire tower road, swallowed by weeds and birch saplings. 2 teenage boys hunting squirrels stumbled across it, just after sunrise during the first hard frost of October. What they discovered barely resembled a man anymore. Sheriff Durning told me the details himself 2 nights later, while standing in Eleanor's kitchen with both hands wrapped around black coffee he had forgotten to drink. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The old sheriff looked 20 years older than when I first met him. "They found pieces first," he said quietly. Eleanor sat frozen at the table, clutching Walter's scarf. She already knew. You could see it in her face. Somewhere deep down she understood this moment had been approaching for months. The sheriff rubbed tired eyes before continuing. Camper from Ohio. 41 years old, divorced, came up here chasing elk rumors. He paused heavily. Medical examiner says some of the wounds happened after death. Some didn't. Nobody spoke. The kitchen clock ticked loudly against the silence. Outside, Jude crouched beneath the porch swing, watching the dark tree line beyond the field. Gabriel stood farther back near the woods, almost invisible except for its eyes reflecting pale gold whenever lightning flashed. Sheriff Durning noticed the creatures eventually. His hand drifted instinctively toward the revolver beneath his coat. Then he looked at me. "You weren't crazy, not accusation, not disbelief, fear." I asked where the body was found exactly. The sheriff described the location near Hollow Creek Ridge. My stomach tightened immediately because I recognized it. The ravine where Gabriel and I buried the dead creature sat less than a mile from there. Looking back, I think Gabriel already knew what happened before any of us did. Animals understand territorial shifts faster than humans. Predators especially. Something had changed in those woods after the attack during summer. Something larger than one violent encounter. Sheriff Durning finally set the untouched coffee aside. "State boys are coming tomorrow. Wildlife teams, too. They think it's a bear attack." Nobody answered him, because all 3 of us knew better. The sheriff lingered awkwardly near the doorway before leaving. Then he stopped suddenly and glanced toward Jude outside the window. "You know the old stories about this valley?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. Every mountain town keeps stories buried beneath generations of silence. Black Hollow had older ones than most. French trappers vanished there during the 1700s. Logging camps abandoned overnight. Missing hunters. Strange livestock deaths. Tribal accounts older than the county itself, warning people never to whistle after dark near the northern ridges. Sheriff Durning stared toward Gabriel, standing motionless at the forest edge. "My grandfather used to call them the mourning things," he whispered, "said they followed grief." Then he left. Rain deepened overnight. Heavy, cold autumn rain that smelled like wet leaves and distant snow. Eleanor could not sleep after the sheriff's visit. Neither could I. Around midnight, we sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, listening to water drip from the roof, while Jude rested near Eleanor's feet. Gabriel remained in the yard facing north. Always north. Watching. Eleanor finally broke the silence first. "Do you think Walter knew?" I looked at her carefully. Knew what? That this would happen eventually. Thunder rolled far away beyond the hills. I thought about Walter finding the injured Jude years earlier beside the ravine. Thought about gifts appearing after that. The long, lonely months before his death. The strange attachment that formed between human beings and things no human should ever trust. I think he wanted to believe kindness mattered, I answered honestly. Eleanor smiled sadly at that. So did I. Jude lifted its head suddenly then. Every muscle tightened. Gabriel growled low in the yard. A moment later we heard it. Howling. Far north at first, then another closer. Then several more overlapping together through the rain-soaked darkness. Not wolves. These sounds carried rhythm almost like language buried inside animal throats. Jude pressed tightly against Eleanor's legs, trembling visibly. Gabriel paced the field edge, fur bristling hard along its spine. The howls grew louder. Closing distance, then stopped all at once. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Eleanor whispered something I still hear clearly years later. They know where we are now. The next morning, state wildlife officers arrived alongside two men from some federal department neither sheriff nor county clerk seemed eager to identify. Clean boots, unmarked jackets, military posture pretending not to be military posture. I recognized the type immediately. One introduced himself as Agent Mercer. That was probably not his real name. They searched the woods north of Eleanor's property all day, while helicopters circled ridgelines overhead. News spread quickly through nearby towns after that. Campers disappeared from state parks. Livestock attacks increased. Hunters reported hearing voices calling from tree lines after dark. Every story sounded ridiculous until enough people repeated it. By evening, Agent Mercer requested to speak with me privately beside the barn. Rain clouds hung low over the valley, turning sunset gray and colorless. Gabriel watched us from the woods during the entire conversation. Mercer noticed the creature almost immediately. Interesting thing was he did not look surprised. "You've seen them before," I said. He remained silent several seconds too long. Then nodded once. Different states, different names, same patterns. Cold settled deep inside my chest. Mercer lit a cigarette carefully while studying the tree line. They usually avoid people unless population pressure changes migration routes. But once attachment forms... He stopped there. "Attachment?" I repeated. He glanced toward Eleanor's house. Food, shelter, emotional fixation. Hard to predict after that. The way he said emotional fixation frightened me worse than anything else. Clinical, practiced, like somebody discussing dangerous dogs. I asked how many creatures existed in the region. Mercer looked genuinely uncertain. Enough. That answer told me more than any number could. Before leaving, Mercer handed me a folded map marked with red circles stretching across 3 counties. Disappearances, animal attacks, unexplained deaths. Every incident circled back to Black Hollow Ridge. Agent Mercer spread photographs and maps across Eleanor's kitchen table, while Jude rested near the fire, and Gabriel watched from the porch. Red circles marked clusters of attacks near abandoned mines, forests, and isolated farms. "You need to get her out of here," Mercer told me quietly. I looked toward Eleanor brushing leaves from Jude's silver fir beside the fireplace. "It's already too late for that," I answered. 3 nights later, the first snow arrived. Thin frost covered the valley beneath a swollen yellow moon, while something circled the property beyond the barn. Not Gabriel, not Jude, different. Heavy breathing moved through the dark alongside strange clicking sounds. Then came a man's scream from deep in the woods. Gabriel exploded toward the tree line before either of us reached the porch. The screaming stopped instantly. By morning, deputies blocked every road leading into Black Hollow. Another body had been found, half-eaten. After that, the town changed. Churches filled, gun stores emptied. Parents stopped letting children outside after dark. And through all of it, Gabriel guarded Eleanor's property more aggressively each night while Jude grew restless and afraid. By November, winter buried the valley completely. Ice sealed the creeks. Snow swallowed fences. That was when Eleanor finally decided to leave. Not because she stopped loving the creatures, because staying meant more people would die. We packed the truck while snow drifted sideways across the fields. Jude followed Eleanor from room to room anxiously while Gabriel stood near the woods staring north toward something unseen. At the porch swing, Eleanor held the broken red checker piece in trembling hands. "I don't know how to say goodbye to them," she whispered. Then Jude approached slowly through the snow and placed Walter's pocket knife gently into her hands. One final gift. Gabriel suddenly growled toward the northern woods. Something else was coming. Shapes moved between the trees beyond the field. 3 of them. Fast, circling. Gabriel stepped forward instantly, placing itself between the house and the approaching creatures. Then the first attacker burst from the woods. Massive. Black fur. Pale blind eyes. Gabriel intercepted it mid-charge, and both creatures crashed violently through the snow while another rushed toward the porch. Jude lunged to stop it. Everything became chaos, snarling, gunshots, blood spraying across drifts. Then a third creature emerged behind the barn. Larger than the others, almost human. It stared directly at Eleanor. I fired into its chest. The thing barely slowed. Gabriel slammed into it before it could reach her, driving both creatures through the porch railing. Nearby, Jude screamed as another attacker tore deep into its side. Then Eleanor stepped between the wounded creature and the attacker holding Walter's pocket knife with shaking hands. "No!" The creature stopped. Recognition crossed its face for one terrible second before Gabriel tore into it again. The attackers finally retreated into the woods after several rifle shots, but the damage was done. Jude lay dying in the snow. Eleanor sobbed beside the creature, while Gabriel lowered itself nearby, making deep, mournful sounds. Jude looked toward the broken red checker piece half buried beneath fresh snow. Eleanor placed it gently into the creature's claws. Jude looked at her one final time, then whispered softly, almost human. Cold now. The creature died moments later beneath falling snow, while Gabriel remained motionless beside the body. No animal should mourn like that, yet Gabriel did. We buried Jude the next morning beside the frozen creek. Eleanor wrapped the checker piece inside Walter's scarf before placing it into the grave. As we prepared to leave Black Hollow forever, Gabriel sat quietly beside the empty porch swing where Jude used to sleep. "You can't come with me," Eleanor whispered through tears. Gabriel never moved while we drove away through the storm, and from deep within the northern woods, dozens of pale eyes watched us leave. We settled in Ash Creek nearly 200 miles south, small logging town beside a river, quiet, forgettable. For 1 week, life almost felt normal again. Then the rain started. Cold November rain hammered the town for 3 straight nights. On the 3rd night, Eleanor woke me after midnight. Listen. 3 slow scratches dragged across the porch outside. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I opened the front door carefully. Gabriel sat beneath the porch light soaked in rainwater, blood crusted along one shoulder from reopened wounds. In one clawed hand, the creature held Eleanor's gardening glove, the same glove it once returned after Walter died. Gabriel had followed us all the way south. Then the creature suddenly looked toward the river woods behind the house and growled low in its chest. Shapes moved through the fog. Watching. The others had followed too. After that, strange things spread through Ash Creek. Dogs disappeared. Livestock turned up mutilated. A fisherman was found torn apart beside the flooded riverbank. Gabriel stayed near Eleanor's house almost every night now, wounded and exhausted, but constantly guarding the property. Then, one cold afternoon, I finally understood why. Eleanor dropped one of Walter's shirts into the mud while hanging laundry. Before she could pick it up, Gabriel crossed the yard silently, lifted the shirt carefully and handed it back without damaging it, like returning another lost thing. That was when I realized Gabriel no longer saw Eleanor as human. It saw her as pack. By Christmas, Ash Creek lived in fear. Curfews spread across town. Helicopters searched the forests while fresh tracks appeared behind grieving families' homes. Widowers, divorced people, parents who lost children. The creatures followed sorrow, and Gabriel understood that before any of us did. One freezing morning, I looked outside and found Eleanor sitting on the porch swing beside Gabriel beneath softly falling snow. The creature sat upright beside her, turning Walter's compass carefully between its claws while the needle trembled. Some moments feel too fragile for language. Later, Eleanor admitted something she had hidden from me. Gabriel cried at night. Not howled. Cried. 3 soft broken sounds repeated over and over beneath the porch beside Jude's buried checker piece wrapped inside Walter's scarf. 3 scratches, 3 knocks, 3 cries. The storm arrived Christmas Eve. Heavy snow buried Ash Creek beneath darkness, while lantern light flickered inside Eleanor's house. Around 10 o'clock, every dog in town began barking at once before falling suddenly silent. Then came howling, close, too close. The smell hit next. Rot, wet fur, blood, and scratching surrounded the house from every side at once. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Then something enormous slammed against the back wall hard enough to shake the photographs loose. Eleanor gasped. Then Gabriel roared outside. The sound exploded through the storm, immediately followed by snarling so violent it barely sounded real. Heavy impacts shook the porch. Claws ripped through wood outside the windows. I grabbed the rifle while lantern light flickered wildly around the room. Another crash struck the back door. Wood splintered inward, then silence. For one terrible second, everything stopped. Even the wind. I heard breathing outside the front porch. Slow, labored. Then 3 gentle knocks against the door. Tap, tap, tap. Eleanor froze completely. Not fear, recognition. She moved toward the door before I could stop her. "Don't," I snapped sharply. But she already understood something I did not. Gabriel never scratched, only knocked. Eleanor opened the door. The creature collapsed inside immediately. Blood covered nearly half its body. Deep gashes crossed its chest and neck. One arm bent wrong near the elbow. Snow clung red beneath matted fur while Gabriel struggled weakly across the floorboards. Something outside shrieked furiously, hearing the door shut. Not Gabriel, another creature. The larger one looked up at Eleanor desperately, then toward the back hallway. Move, hide. Even injured nearly to death, Gabriel was still protecting her. The back window shattered seconds later. A thin gray creature lunged halfway into the kitchen, snarling wildly before I fired point blank into its face. The blast hurled it backward into the snow outside. More movement circled the house immediately. Heavy footsteps. Growling. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate from it. Gabriel forced itself upright despite the injuries. Blood dripped steadily onto the floor while the creature staggered toward the broken kitchen window. Then another shape appeared outside, the blind-eyed creature from Black Hollow. Larger now, somehow. Starved. Fur hanging in rotten clumps from exposed ribs. Its pale eye fixed directly on Eleanor. The thing smiled. God help me, it smiled. Gabriel crashed through the broken window before either of us could react, slamming into the blind-eyed creature as more shadows poured from the storm around the house. The fight outside sounded less like animals and more like war. Wood splintered. Bodies crashed through fences. Howls twisted through the blizzard while gunshots echoed across Ash Creek. Then came Gabriel's scream, not anger, pain. Eleanor ran into the storm before I could stop her. Snow blasted sideways across the yard where blood stained the drifts black beneath the porch light. Gabriel lay barely moving near the steps while 3 creatures circled it. One already lay dead beside the fence. The blind-eyed creature stood over Gabriel, preparing to finish it. Eleanor screamed Gabriel's name. For one impossible second, everything froze. Then the blind-eyed creature lunged. Gabriel moved faster, even dying. The creature threw itself between Eleanor and those claws, taking the blow straight through its chest. Silence followed instantly as snow drifted around us and Gabriel collapsed at Eleanor's feet. Then the town erupted. Gunshots thundered from nearby houses. Men shouted, searchlights cut through the storm. The remaining creatures vanished into the darkness beyond the river. Gabriel lay motionless beside the porch while Eleanor sobbed over the body. With its final strength, the creature pushed Walter's compass into her hands before its breathing finally stopped. By morning, the storm had buried most of the blood beneath fresh snow. Agent Mercer arrived with armed men who seemed far too familiar with what they were looking at. He called the creatures the mourning things, old stories hidden for generations, creatures that appeared wherever grief settled deeply enough. Before leaving, Mercer handed me photographs dating back 70 years. Different states, different widows, different decades, and always the same creature standing near the tree line behind them. Gabriel. We buried Gabriel beside Jude near the frozen creek at Black Hollow Ridge. Eleanor placed Walter's compass and the broken red checker piece into the grave before whispering, "Nobody should spend forever looking for what they've lost." For a while, life returned to something almost normal. Eleanor planted flowers. I repaired furniture. But grief never truly leaves a place once it settles there. One evening, years later, she asked me quietly, "Do you think Gabriel understood love?" I remembered the creature carrying Walter's lost belongings back to her, crossing 200 miles to follow her south, dying to protect her during the storm, not instinct, choice. I think it understood losing it, I told her. Eleanor died peacefully 3 winters later. The morning after her funeral, I heard scratching at the porch. 3 slow drags across the wood. I already knew. Outside, standing near the tree line beneath falling snow, waited the blind-eyed creature, older now, scarred, Walter's scarf hanging around its neck. For one terrible moment, I thought it had come to kill me. Instead, it stepped forward and gently placed something onto the porch swing, the broken red checker piece, whole again. The creature looked at me one last time before disappearing into the woods forever. And sitting there alone until dawn, holding that checker piece in my hands, I finally understood the truth none of us wanted to face. The creatures never followed grief because they fed on it. They followed grief because grief was the only thing they recognized in us.